My name is Dale Bondanza. I'm currently residing in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Some of you may refer to that as the seventh ring of hell, especially in the summertime. However, I am originally from Buffalo, New York, which means when people hear the North Pole, they think Santa. When I hear the North Pole, I think, yeah, that's just Tuesday. Couldn't be more opposite ends of the earth to move from Buffalo, New York to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. But yet, here we are. Welcome to my presentation today on Leadership Gap 2030, presented by my company, FractionalsEdge, which is a DBA of DAB Enterprises, LLC. Let's get started. I present to you today the standard disclaimer. The views and predictions presented today reflect my personal opinions, and the presentation is intended to provoke thinking, not predict the future with any certainty, and most specifically is USA focused. Our agenda today is focused on what is FractionalsEdge, this company that I created approximately a year and a half ago, and talk a little bit about this crystal ball that I envision. We're going to talk a little bit more about all the other subjects on the screen. I'm not going to read them throughout there for you, but there are some more controversial subjects that we're going to talk about today, but we'll highlight them as we go through. A little bit more about my background. Again, not going to read through that entire slide, but I'll leave it up there for a minute for you all to go back and read throughout. You can always pause the presentation if you like, as this is being published to YouTube and then will eventually be published to other platforms as well. But suffice to say, I've been in IT my entire career, which is over 30 years. And I've always been in IT, but in a variety of industries, including manufacturing, financials, pharmaceuticals, medical device, the government, yes, the local government, including education, which is primary K, kindergarten through 12. I've been in healthcare, publishing, all kinds of industries. I've been in major global implementations of ERPs, including SAP and Oracle. I was employed with Broward County Public Schools as the director of the Office of the CIO during the tragic events that transpired at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in February of 2018. My primary focus, which you'll hear throughout the presentation, is people, process, and technology, but more about that in the coming slides. Let's talk about a little bit about my background, a little pictorial representation of my background, a little all over the board. I've lived many lives in my lifetime, but I've spent 17 years as a volunteer firefighter when I still lived up north in Philadelphia. Again, I said I was originally from Buffalo, but I spent 17 years in Philadelphia. I grew up most of my adult life there, but also having been a firefighter there is also when I had a health epiphany there in my early 40s and became a competitive runner. Moved to Florida back in 2012, where I eventually met my now wife, Annie, and her two stepchildren there, viewed in the center of the picture. And eventually, after my competitive running career began, I also wrote a book called 60 and 6, Everything Your Mother Told You to Do. You also see on the screen there, my only child is my beautiful four-legged fur baby there called Zoe. She is a 6-year-old Bernie Doodle. I mentioned we'd hear this subject more than a few times, but my brand at DAB Enterprises and FractionalsEdge is people, process, and technology in that order. Don't screw it up. I'm not going to help you implement technology to make your crappy process give you crappy results faster. As a Six Sigma guy, I'm not going to help you implement a process that your people can't support. And at the end of the day, it's all about the people that we have in the workforce. We have 4 generations in the workforce here today as of summer 2026, and we're about to add another generation, the Alpha generation, within the next 2 years. More about that in a moment. So let's go to our next slide. So this slide, very important. I identify personally with my generation. I'm a Generation X, and the generations that are older than me. However, the reason I'm presenting Leadership Gap 2030 is because I fully represent and understand the opinions, perspectives, and penchants of all the generations younger or under me, which is why I'm giving this presentation. What I want you to take away from this slide in particular is I really want you to hone in on your specific generation of your age, of whomever is watching this presentation. The reason this is key is I'm going to speak specifically to the generational differences throughout this presentation. So it's really important that you focus in on this slide. And again, as I just mentioned in the previous slide, while we currently have 5 generations, or about to have 5 generations in the workforce, from boomers currently to zoomers, but adding alpha within the next 2 years, as alpha generation is currently 16 years old, but will be joining the workforce as they're 18 because they'll be joining without degrees because, as we'll learn in a little while, they now know that they don't need them anymore. But also, don't forget that there is still a slim margin of the population, and again, we'll see it in a later slide, that there are still some silent generation that still exist in today's workforce. Again, more on that later. Let's throw out some basic definitions. What is a fractional? You've heard this term a lot in today's workforce. I specifically, because I'm in the IT field, you'll specifically hear me refer to CIO or CTO, a Chief Information Officer or a Chief Technology Officer. What is a fractional is not a virtual CIO. A fractional is not a consultant. It is not an interim position or an interim employee. Fractional does mean having skin in the game. If you're familiar with the RACI model, which is responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed, fractional truly represents the big A, which is accountable, or that they own the seat on the accountability chart that they're responsible for. A VCIO, which is often confused with a fractional, is more of an account manager, an interim consultant type position. It's a short-term role. We need to stop thinking with the 50-year-old consulting mindset of what people call a VCIO. That is not a fractional. Let's also talk briefly about coaching and mentoring. Those are important and will be important later as we talk about what the fractional consulting model is. Coaching, very different than mentoring. Coaching is developing skills that already exist. Think about pro sports when you think about a coach on the sidelines, while you have professional athletes on the field who are at the peak of their career. Well, why do they need a coach? The coach is there to tweak or improve skills that are already at the peak of performance, but they just need to be tweaked just ever so slightly. Mentoring, on the other hand, is actually teaching skills that do not exist today. That is an important distinction, as we'll talk more about in a little while. Generations, and why is this important, and why are generations not ageism? Again, more to come on that, but there is a distinct difference as to why we talk about why generations are important when it comes to fractional. Fractional, it's an incentive, it's a term, it's a commitment. There's a duration associated with it. There's a compensation structure associated with fractional that is different than all those other methods that I mentioned, such as interim or virtual or consultant. The relationship of a fractional employee is different in its scope and its nature. Let's move on. So what is the vision of FractionalsEdge? Well, if we go back to the generational slide, the reason I threw that up there is because here in 2026, the youngest boomer is 62 years old. Therefore, over the next 4 to 11 years, as boomers begin to exit the workforce, there are not enough of us Gen Xers to fill those boomer spots. There aren't enough Gen Y, also called millennials, to fill our Xer spots. And that's especially important because only 58% of millennials are having children with only a 1.8 replacement rate. That means that the 58% of millennials that are having children are only having, on average, 1.8 children. Now, there are enough Gen Z to replace the Gen Y workforce because Gen Z are currently having children at a 2.1 replacement rate. However, Gen Z is also between the ages of 17 and 29. So the jury's still out on whether or not that birth rate will raise or lower. What does it mean to create a Gen Z or an alpha manager, as we say on this slide? We need to mentor, remember the difference between mentoring and coaching. We need to mentor these generations on how to manage the 5 to 10 bots that will be reporting to them over the coming years. So the reason, again, that this slide is important and the vision of Fractionals Edge is that as the boomers begin to exit from the workforce, our formula at Fractionals Edge is that Gen X will fractionally fill those boomer spots while simultaneously coaching Gen Y to fill our spots, while simultaneously mentoring the younger Gen Y, Gen Z, Gen Alpha to fill their spots and cascade upward, while backfilling Gen Z, simultaneously mentoring and creating Gen Z and Gen Alpha managers, all to cascade upward as they're continuing to manage not necessarily employees, but bots that they will be managing in the future. We reflect this in a case study for a $70 million faith-based social services provider describing the client's decentralized IT challenges and the consulting organization's fractional CIO engagement and deliverables and the resulting benefits, including repeatable investment process, updated provider agreements, data protection, foundation for a high-performing centralized IT organization, and the hiring of an eventual full-time IT director. This is a quick slide, but the target market for Fractionals Edge is really targeted at the small and medium-sized market. This is due to the significant, and again, we'll talk a little bit more about this later, and you'll see some slides on this, but the impending significant mergers and acquisitions and private equity activity in the very near term, that is over the next 5 years, prior and upcoming to 2030, in the industry and technology expansion and as the workforce population declines. And you can read this slide again for yourself. But Bain and McKinsey have predicted this elevated activity over the next 4 to 5 years, massive industry expansion, and significant pressure downward on the workforce population. This is a very important slide because these numbers represent the amount of workers in millions across the various generations. So with boomers heading out of the labor force, they're no longer but growing into the huge dependent population that they will eventually be. You can see, as per this slide, that the largest percentage of the workforce currently is now made up of millennials and Gen X, with a growing number of Gen Z entering the workforce. Boomers on a rapid decline. And as I mentioned earlier, there is still 1.2 million silent generation. Remember, those are folks over 81 years old that are still participating in the workforce. Now, I'll put jokes aside that most of those folks are in the US Congress and the Senate, and, we'll leave all those jokes aside. But there is still 0.7% of the workforce of the silent generation. And those numbers are from the Census Bureau's current population survey and Lightcast analysis through 2023. And that is referred to, as the slide says, the silver tsunami. So we'll mention more about the silver tsunami as well in coming slides. Let's talk about the first outer band. So the labor force participation rate, as you can imagine, took a serious hit in 2020, and it hasn't recovered since. There was an initial massive loss of boomers from the workforce due to the global pandemic and COVID. The reason this is important to take into consideration, and the reason I highlighted the labor force participation rate, or LFPR, the reason you should take note of this is I'm going to mention LFPR in future slides. And why I want you to take note of that is there is a significant difference between what you will hear in the media or on the news between unemployment numbers and LFPR. Do not be confused when the media uses unemployment as a statistic. It is a misleading statistic. It is greatly underreported. And we'll explain why in a couple slides. This slide reinforces the previous slide. So out of the 5 million people who left the labor force since the pandemic, 80% of those workers were over the age of 55. So there are 3 million more people who have retired now than were projected to in 2019. And you can see the graph for those older workers dropping sharply. Now, interestingly enough, as the boomers age into new cohorts, the remainder will leave the labor force in droves. So when they start to leave, they're going to leave en masse. They're staying longer than most previously expected, however. So while I said the boomers will start to exit the workforce over the next 4 to 11 years, they are staying, and again, you'll see this in a couple slides about expected retirement age. Many of them are staying up until the age of 70 to 74. From 2024 to 2034, the US population will outpace the labor force growth by nearly 3 to 1. Since 1970, the expected retirement length has increased by 5.8 years for men and 4.7 years for women. Take special note of the 5 million number there, because that's coming again in 2 slides. And that's going to be a significantly important slide of why that is an increase in consumers and how that's going to drastically affect us. This is the slide I mentioned a few minutes ago, because every generation says they plan to retire earlier than the generation before. The average person today says they're going to retire at age 66. The actual average for what every generation says currently is 62. Gen Z, those folks less than 30 years old, believe that they're going to retire at 57, whereas most boomers today believe that they're going to retire at 68. But as I just said a few slides ago, statistics show otherwise. Most of them are staying until they're 70 to 74. So again, this survey, as you can see, was taken by Mass Mutual 2 years ago, and those numbers are already starting to slide to the right. Okay, this is the most important slide that we presented to date. So I'm going to spend a second on this one. The Bureau of Labor Statistics projects the U.S. labor force will net only 5.3 million workers by 2034. So today, in 2026, that means over the next 8 years, remember I said LFPR earlier, that's an important statistic. Only 5 million new workers will enter the labor force over the next 8 years. Of those 5.3 million workers, 2.9 million of them are expected to be over the age of 65. Simultaneously, during that 8-year time frame, 16 to 24-year-old labor force projections are expected to shrink by 2 million. So again, that 2 million isn't included in the 5.3, obviously, because those aren't entering the workforce. So keep that number very important in your mind over the next coming slides, because we're going to talk about that 5.3 million, of which more than 50% of that are over the age of 65. Think about that for a minute as we progress. So what's the dilemma? The educated labor force and the disappearance of men. Here's one of those controversial slides I talked about, a couple of them coming up. Currently, again, this is the LFPR that I mentioned versus the unemployment stats that are being underreported. And the reason that we're all being deceived by the underreporting of the unemployment stats, there are currently 7 million, rounded, 7 million men that are not even participating in the workforce. My audience, I ask you, what are 7 million men doing for 2,000 hours a year and contributing somewhat financially, albeit minimally, to the economy? What are those 7 million men doing? Video games? Swiping right? Trying to be influencers? We know there aren't 7 million TikTok, Insta, YouTube influencers out there. Maybe there's a small portion of them that are, but there are not 7 million of them. Here's another stark controversy. This one might get me in trouble. Let's talk about some of the demographic shifts in the US. We're going to come back to the one in the upper left. But I mentioned earlier, only 58% of millennials are having children with a 1.6 replacement rate. The social connection may weaken after the workforce exit. That's why the Grim Reaper and the sickle are up there, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. This is the second most important slide, by the way, that we've hit so far. Gen Z, the replacement rate is 2.1. I mentioned that earlier as well. The birth rate since 1950, or in 1950, was 3.57 versus today's blended rate of 1.58. So again, still below replacement rate. And if you're questioning what replacement rate is, that means if you're not having enough children to even replace yourself, that projects that into the future, if we don't have enough children to replace ourselves, as a species, as a human species, we won't exist in a number of generations projected out into the future. Women in the workforce in 1950 were 35%. Interestingly enough, 70% of valedictorians graduating from high school today are girls. 20% of men ages 25 to 34 still live at home. That's up from 14% 10 years ago. 15% of men report no close friends. 62% of men under 30 aren't even actively dating. 42% of men 18 to 24 have never asked a woman out in person. And what's gravely grim is that if you walk into a morgue and you look at suicides, 4 out of 10 of the people who have committed suicides in morgues are men. That's a very disturbing statistic. I'm going to go back up to the upper left-hand corner for a second because it's one that disturbs a lot of the parents of friends that I speak with that are millennials or Gen X or even boomers that have millennial children. And it's very hard to consume, but it is nonetheless a statistic. The millennial generation, Gen Y, is the first generation in history predicted to not outlive their parents. And that is because of the 1.6 replacement rate. Now, I'm going to give a silver lining for that. Of the 58% of millennials that are having children, now, while we wish their replacement rate was above 2, to those folks, it's a good sign. The bad sign is the 42% of the millennials who aren't having any children. Those 42% are not expected to outlive their parents. The silver lining is, if this helps at all, is that mom and dad, those children will have lived their best lives because having no children, they will have dual careers. They will be what we called in the 80s dinks, dual income, no kids. They'll have had great professions. They'll have made a lot of money. They'll have toured the world. They'll have done everything on their bucket list before they leave the bounds of this earth. But having no children, psychologists and sociologists have predicted that when they leave the workforce, when they eventually retire, they will have no psychosocial or social emotional connection to the greater collective, that is humanity. And when they break and exit the workforce, psychologists have expected their rate of morbidity to exceed their parents' generation. Let's talk about the college conundrum, another controversial subject. 60% of all open jobs across the US currently do not require a college degree. Any professors or folks that work in the university, you might want to go get a drink or take your bathroom break at this point. And if you don't, please don't turn off this presentation. But please stick around to the end to help us fix this conundrum. Corporate America is progressively attempting to remove degree requirements from job descriptions and substitute years of experience instead of degree requirements. Nearly all of our most posted jobs in America do not require a college degree. The most requested job across America, to the tune of 716,000 postings, are registered nurses. That is the only job, as you can see, among the top 10 that truly requires a degree, other than maybe health services managers, which is a little further down the list. So again, the top two things that need degrees in the top 10 positions are in the healthcare field. I will argue, as a 30-year IT professional, that you see software developers down there. That's not true. That field no longer needs degrees. Computer science, sure, it's a great degree. I got one back in 80 something, but 90 something. I had to think about that for a second. You no longer need a computer science or an MIS degree to go into the IT field. I used to be an educational snob. I used to believe greatly in that. We can have that conversation offline, or you can put those questions in the chat. But other than registered nurses, if you're sending your kids to college for anything other than that, and you'll see in the coming slides why, save your money. And nursing only accounted for 12% of the degrees conferred in 2023 versus 19% of business degrees. Why? Students may be pursuing the wrong major. I thought this slide was kind of humorous. 1 in 5 college-bound students said finance was the most likely major to ensure their successful career. That's why I put the arrow in there. I said, who's asking college kids themselves? Well, that's your first mistake. Who's letting their kids spend 6 figures to get a business degree unless you're going to Wharton or an Ivy League school? And even then, quite frankly, STEM, trades, military, if they want a future, sure, I have to throw in arts. That's because my wife's a professional musician. But you can also do most of those without taking out a mortgage to put yourself through an education. Also, of worthy note, notice that there are 1.7 trillion in student loan debt currently, and that's not shrinking, and that's not going away anytime soon. Let's talk about the top 7 largest projected growth jobs over the next 8 years. We kind of said it previously. Home health and personal care aides, no degree requirements. Software developers, I told you previously, even though that has an asterisk, I don't believe, I will tell you as a CIO, that's not true. Those do not require degrees. Stock orders and fillers, fast food counter workers, cooks in restaurants, registered nurses, the only one on the list, top projected growths over the next 8 years that actually require a degree. We alluded to this earlier. Prime age male workforce participation. Again, controversy over the next 3 slides coming, just letting you know now. I mentioned earlier that there are 7 million workforce age men who aren't even participating in the labor force. The LFPR for men aged 25 to 54 fell sharply as soon as the millennials reached the age of workforce participation. You can see that back in 2010, as well as post-pandemic in 2023. Let's talk about 9 occupations that are over 90% male occupied. Now, ladies, we would love to have you, especially the fact that 70% of women are valedictorians from their high school class. We would love to have ladies participate in the trades, plumbing, electricians, carpenters, machinists, welders. Those who follow Mike Rowe, who are very familiar with Mike Rowe, he currently came out with a statistic literally in June of 2026. There are currently 400,000 openings for welders across America. yet the profession is 94% occupied by men. All of these professions in the trades, male dominated, yet we're losing men from the workforce in droves. Yet these are all highly paid six-figure occupations, no degree required. The unemployment rate for production occupation remains at historical low. Over the next 9 years, the US expects 9 to 10 trillion, that's T, trillion in infrastructure buildouts. All of those requirements, all of those trades on the previous slide are needed. And for those of you who are thinking, well, Uncle Elon said his robots are going to replace all of us. They're not going to replace those 9 jobs before your Gen Z or Gen Alpha children have a productive career in those 9 trades. Feel assured. So, is it realistic to anticipate the retirement age population to carry the majority of the population in the labor force? Obviously not. Remember, the boomers only make up 15% of the labor force participation rate today. More controversy. We're not going to get into a geopolitical discussion here, other than to recognize the situation that exists in the US and how it's swung to both ends of the pendulum over the last 10 years. In the new estimates released from the Congressional Budget Office, the native-born population inversion was moved up 6 years to 2033 from the original estimate made 4 years ago, because the CBO did not see the massive decline in immigration that was coming. What that means, and you can see this projection goes all the way back to 2005, goes all the way out to 2055, but by 2033, you can see that the number of births minus deaths versus net immigration coming into the country, the population inversion, that means more people will be coming into the country than will be being born in the country. And that's at the current rate of immigration if we don't change anything. The native born, as I just said, this is a setup slide for what's coming, and it explains the inversion if it wasn't already obvious. The native born labor force is likely inverting, but will increase intensity by 2030. So, as we just said, this graph represents the population change if 65-year-olds exit the workforce, subtracted from 16-year-olds entering the workforce. Now, this is an interesting slide, and I'm not going to lie. When I was rehearsing this whole presentation and passing this by some friends and colleagues, I seem to be the only one that found this slide more fascinating than other people, because I quizzed a lot of my contemporary Gen X and Gen Y friends and parents. But the reason I found this slide interesting is that the labor force participation rate of teens 16 to 19 peaked among baby boomers and Gen X, and then fell dramatically when millennials entered their teen years. What that means is that when millennials and Gen Z turned approximately 16, they didn't have jobs for the most part, as you can see by the graph, when they turned teenagers, as opposed to those of us in the Gen X or the boomer generation. And I asked a lot of my contemporaries why they thought that was. Now, again, I'm going to pass by this slide pretty quickly, but if you're watching this presentation, I'd like you to consider that in your mind. If you have kids that were millennials or Gen Z, or if you yourself are a millennial or Gen Z, did you work when you were a teenager, or did your kids work when they were teenagers? Of the folks in my demographic that I surveyed, I was surprised to see that it pretty much matched up with this graph, that while some did, most did not. I found that fascinating. Others not so much. Similarly, another slide I thought was fascinating, and maybe it's because I spent 5 years working for the school district down here in Florida, But I also think it's interesting that over the next 15 years, high school graduation rates across America will drop by an average of 10%. You can see the interesting slide, and there's a link to this graph in the presentation. But you can see state by state, green versus red, the states that will increase over the next 15 years versus the states that are projected to decrease. Now, there are states that are predicted to decrease, such as Hawaii, by 33% graduation rates over the next 15 years, as opposed to states like Florida that will increase graduation rates over by 12% over the next 15 years. Again, just a fascinating thing to take into consideration. Let's talk about one of our important subjects, AI. AI is being used now. Where it's being used now is not in any of the areas that the severe labor shortages are expected. How are most companies using AI today? Customer service, cybersecurity, digital assistance, customer management, customer relationship management, inventory management, etc. Between 2025 and 2035, so approximately over the next 10 years, the runway in all sectors, specifically for private equity regarding mergers and acquisitions, will be massive. But if you're not familiar with private equity, which is all about EBITDA, earnings before income tax, depreciation, and amortization, be careful of investing yourself in that market or the respective portfolio companies within that market. This slide is important because it's a setup for future slides. Because we all know that the AI bubble is forming. Many people think it's about to burst. Some people think it's just going to keep growing. But we are certainly not currently getting any employment benefit from it. During the past 2 years, as the bubble has reached epic highs, jobs have seen year-over-year gains in total private payrolls at their lowest non-recession related levels since the 60s. Ergo, no growth. So while AI accounted for 80% of gains in the stock market, 40% of growth in the US GDP, incredible investments in processing equipment related to the GDP, not so much on the job front. And despite all that money and hype, AI is not currently creating new jobs. Now, I will say the money invested in AI is 17 times the dot-com bubble, 4 times the subprime bubble, both of which added millions of jobs, 14 million in the dot-com era, 17 in the subprime era. AI costs are taking jobs currently, not necessarily AI itself. Now, again, as a 30-year IT person and a computer scientist, I'm obviously a huge supporter of AI. I do believe that the net of AI at the end of the day will increase jobs. The question is when. The other altruism that we speak of in the IT industry is that AI will not replace your job, but your unwillingness to lean into it and to learn it and take advantage of it will absolutely be your downfall. But as I said, currently, it's not doing anything for employment. Most of the sectors have been frozen for the past several years, as these graphs indicate. You can read the Foundry study up top. However, I can personally attest to the Atlassian study at the bottom. Demonstrating and documenting specific ROI for AI investments has been incredibly difficult, and there has been a huge resistance, or maybe more of an ignorance, from our business partners to offer use cases for use within the organization. Maybe it's due to a fear or misunderstanding, but as you can see, 96% of companies do not see dramatic AI ROI in productivity, quality, or communications. Lack of issue. The issue is a lack of use cases. Again, I can personally represent and defend that this is true in the companies that I've worked with. Similar to the previous slide, the stats speak for themselves on this slide. So I'm only going to read the bottom of this. You can kind of read the percentages and the text on this and or even slow the presentation if you want. But AI status as a workforce solution is still unproven. It's likely to help in some areas, but the scale and timing remain uncertain. We know the administrative burden that it's lifting from many of us in the workforce, but again, scale is what's important. You need to find a historically unprecedented $2 trillion in product revenue in the next 4 years during the slowest projected labor force growth that we've seen since the Great Depression, almost 100 years ago, with many countries' populations inverting, not just the US. Also, we've starved other industries of capital to pay for the AI investments, setting their hiring back and driven up everybody's utilities costs, as you can see at the bottom. Shrinking work pools, downward labor force growth, aging populations. Meanwhile, capital diversion effects, driven towards higher utility costs while we have hiring setbacks, underfunding industries of manufacturing, retail, and other industries. For the past 10 years, nearly every developed country, not just the US, has seen 0 to 15% population decline. This is both your entering labor force people as well as your next consumers. Japan's population has declined by almost 6.3 million since 2010. GDP has barely moved in 16 years there. China's population has fallen the past 3 years. Eastern Europe is shrinking. Russia is short 2.2 million workers and seen its population decline by 4 million since its peak, including 100,000 lost in the current war with the Ukraine, which has lost 1.25 million citizens, mostly men, due to the war. Italy will decline by 1 million by 2030, and so on, again, as represented by the graphs above. AI, older workers, and college grads are all coming for the same jobs. The lopsided workforce will leave millions of important jobs unfilled. Let's talk about the boomer mindset reframed. And we're going to go from the top left. So we're going to speak to each one of these blocks here because I believe that these are important. So the boomer mindset from the top left, let's talk about education. The old thinking used to be higher education will help me get the job I want. But the new thinking is with degrees abundant, the importance will be on having a degree is in dire need. So that is, you don't need one. The old thinking was, I need to weigh the benefit of a family against its cost to my career. The new thinking is, we have to figure out how to make pathways to having families, or the spiral will continue. The old thinking, number 3, I will move to get the job I want. The new thinking is, labor force mobility is close to all-time lows. Now, the RTO statistic that I can speak to, which is return to office, which has been an increasing trend in the last couple of years post-pandemic, this is also going to be a very controversial subject. So I'm going to leave a moment to think for folks to let this one soak in. For those of you who own companies out there, particularly in the SMB market, I will again say this as an IT leader, as a CIO, I am a huge supporter of hybrid and remote workers. However, thanks to AI and thanks to remote monitoring software, it is a proven statistic across the industry that 15% of remote workers are stealing time from their companies. If you want to learn more about that, DM or LinkedIn me directly, because that is a proven statistic, and I will explain how and why that is. Number 4, the old thinking was immigrants are taking our job. I don't want to increase immigration. The new thinking is immigration and immigrants are a strategic asset. There will be no way to sustain our service economy without them. The old thinking of job politics was my highest political priorities are creating jobs and decreasing unemployment. The new thinking is employment is becoming a zero-sum game. If you bring in jobs, it will take workers from other companies in your area. It could be your company. And now retirement. I can't wait to retire because I can't keep up with all this new technology. Well, guess what? Social Security and Medicare and a lack of support and longer projected lifespans means I have to return to work. That's another setup for a coming slide. Let's talk about entitlement or learned cynicism. Many Gen X and boomers have complained that Gen Y, millennials, and Gen Z have entitled attitudes and perspectives. But Simon Sinek, who some of you may know, offers another perspective shaped by our own words, because we all know that children learn from both imitation and are influenced from what they hear and see. Maybe Gen X, boomers, who value emotional intelligence, leave some empathy on the table. Entitlement may be coming from social media without the requisite parenting. Let's listen to this 3-minute clip from Simon Sinek. Give me a minute to drag it onto the screen.
We bring our own story to work, and that story is a lens, and we evaluate everybody else that we're with through our lens. And what we need to do doesn't mean you have to agree with people, but it does mean you have to understand where it comes from. We have all these labels and judgments, especially of younger generations, and I guess the younger generations have it of us, again, based on that lens. But I'll give you an example. So when I was young in my career, if you wanted a raise or a promotion, the way you got it was you work really, really hard, you accomplish something, you go to your boss and be like, look what I did, I deserve a raise or a bonus. And that was how things were done. And kids now will come to me and be like, pay me more and you'll see what I can do. And I'm like, shouldn't you do something first? And we label that as entitlement because it sure sounds like it, right? So the question I'm asking is, where did that come from?
Yeah.
That's the empathy. Where did that come from? And then you take one step back and be like, all right, let's look at how capitalism and business and leadership has sort of progressed over the past 20, 30 years, 30, 40 years, right? And you start to see a pattern where in the 80s and 90s, this Jack Welch GE rise of short-termism. You start to see short-termism become normalized, like quarterly results are the thing. You start to see the rise of shareholder supremacy, where we now prioritize the wants, needs, and desires of a disinterested external constituency over a customer or an employee. That's now normal. And by the way, we used to think private companies were better than public companies because they didn't have the same pressure. The number of companies that are venture-backed, you now have a disinterested external who's putting pressure on you so they can meet their financial goals, not yours. Right? So I think the pressure is just as bad in a lot of private companies as well. We start to see mass layoffs where the company's profitable, but we want it to be more profitable, so you get to lose your job. Right? Like that is now normal. Like we don't even think that's shocking. And so now you look at a young generation who's entering the workforce, and I guarantee you close to 100% of them, one of their parents was laid off or one of their friends' parents was laid off through no fault of their own. It's not a meritocracy. The company missed its annual projections. They did fine. They just missed the number, and somebody lost their job. So what they've seen, they've grown up now in a world that demands loyalty, but offers none. And so now you look at their behavior, and they're thinking to themselves, right, this is not, the cultural response is, well, the company's going to offer me nothing. I might work my brains out, and at the end of the year, I'm just going to get laid off anyway. Might as well cash in early. Might as well get that money up front because there's no guarantees. And they're right. That is the correct response for the business world that we live in today. And so that's what I mean by empathy. Because if you don't ask, where did that come from? And you don't peel the onion a little bit, what you'll do is you'll call them entitled, you'll treat them as entitled, you will put all these barriers up and try and teach them your way, which is not appropriate for the times we live in.
So I thought that was a great clip from Simon Sinek, because I know that at one point in time, I felt the same way. And it's one of the reasons I put this presentation together, because I quickly came about to that same feeling and understanding. So let's talk about how work can get done. So we talked earlier about the 5.3 million workers who are coming back into the workforce over the next 9 years. We talked about the fact that over 50% of them are over the age of 65. What we didn't talk about was why, over the next 9 years, are 50% of the folks re-entering the workforce over the age of 65. If they're net new to the workforce and they're over the age of 65, how are they new? They can only be new under one of two conditions. Either they were never in the workforce to begin with, or they were in the workforce, they left the workforce, and now they're re-entering the workforce. Because this is not a live audience presentation, I'm just going to ask you to answer that question in your head to say, why? Why are they either entering the workforce for the first time or now re-entering the workforce? The answers are pretty much self-evident throughout the presentation that you've seen so far. And that is, for the most part, to say, and I can represent this as a Gen X of parents who were the silent and the greatest generation who are now passed away, but that Medicare, Social Security just ain't doing it. Or if one spouse has passed away and the other spouse is now trying to make ends meet and finding that, again, Medicare and Social Security and the retirement package that they may have had just aren't enough. And all of a sudden they realized that now they're living longer, and the retirement plan that they had that maybe put them out to 85, that's how long they thought they were going to live. And now all of a sudden they realize that they're going to live a lot longer than 85. It's forcing them to reconsider returning to the workforce. And that's why those statistics are what they are. So how can the work now get done? We will need to educate boomers re-entering the workforce and capitalize on their former experience, but having them function in lower level capacities because they're okay including the request for lower dollars. They don't need to make what they made when they left the workforce. They only need to make enough to patch what they're missing now that they're retired. Globalization, cyclical insourcing and outsourcing, that's been occurring since the last century. Every 10 years, we go in phases about shifting work offshore, onshore, nearshore. It's always been a thing. Automation. This doesn't mean that we're losing jobs to AI efficiencies. Again, as we said earlier, you're not losing your job to AI, you're losing it to your lack of understanding of it. And immigration. Very lasered and controlled approach must be used. This does not mean unrestricted immigration. It means selective, skills-based immigration and strategic outsourcing aligned to the labor shortages and business needs. Let's look at a couple more quick case studies. This is a case study of a fractional CIO advisory engagement for a $120 million East Coast moving and logistics company, starting with a technology assessment and roadmap, and then providing ongoing IT leadership, cloud migration, security and governance tooling, a portfolio and process improvement to build a mature, efficient, strategically aligned IT environment. Another great case study was where a fractional CIO advisory engagement for a $3.5 billion regional construction company that migrated IT from a parent-hosted on-prem setup to a modern cloud environment, optimized business processes, built and coached the IT organization, there's that word coached, implemented cybersecurity and governance, and delivered a scalable, business-aligned application portfolio and service model. Roughly 1 in 10 job postings are geared toward the entry-level worker, meaning that 90% of postings are not looking to train or upskill a job candidate. Only 10% of postings value over a decade of experience. Yet half the people, 25 to 44, have completely changed their careers. When companies hire this way, they need to know that they're looking for what 9 out of 10 of their competitors are. Remember, if you're in talent acquisition, recruiting, HR, or you're a business leader, what you steal gets stolen, driving up everyone's costs. We are all fishing from the same pond of resources and competing against ourselves. Ergo, that third box there that says this is a zero-sum hiring game. We must think about things differently. Our last case study. It was a 4-week organization and effectiveness review for one of the country's largest material and medical material supplier. Their name is actually up top, that assessed systems, staff, processes, and infrastructure, and then delivered a future state IT model, disaster recovery, business continuity plan, recommendations, and a plan that successfully outsourced the data center to a local quality provider. So as we're coming to the end here, let's talk about why should we hire the tips of the diamonds? I think this slide speaks for itself, but a focus really should be on the average tenure component and lack of loyalty that Simon Sinek discussed earlier across the industry, and deservedly so. The overfished middle market is exactly what I said 2 slides ago. While there may be more of a requirement to teach older workers re-entering the workforce technology skills, there's less of a need to teach them business skills and work ethic. Companies must decide which trade-off is worth it because the resources are only staying for the same amount of time. That is 3 to 5 years maximum, no matter how much you think your company is on the greatest places to work list. So, is it easier to train an entry-level worker with 2 to 5 years of experience, the business and the work ethic you think they need? Or is it easier to train an older worker the technology? An interesting decision. Again, the average tenure among all workers today is 3 to 5 years. The loyalty that you think existed at one point in time, sorry, not there. Thing of the past. So, what do we need more of, less of, and remain neutral on as we move towards the future? We need more of non-college educated folks. What are those? Police, air traffic controllers, pilots, military. Less of education. The significant drop in young populations has led to widespread school closures, not just in the US, but in Japan, Korea, and it's coming to the rest of the developed world. Some of the things that remain neutral, as you can see, entertainment, tourism, financial services. You can see some of the highest priority demand areas on under the more of senior housing and assisted living. Again, as we mentioned earlier, as the boomers age, they're living longer. There's going to be those significant needs in memory and healthcare, personal care, aging support. The labor gap demands are significantly increasing. Some of the strongest growth acceleration areas, skilled trades, energy, manufacturing support, critical non-degree roles. So what are some of your takeaways from today? From the left, let's go clockwise from the top left. Why are things changing? This is a different word for some. Demo economic factors changing at hyperspeed. Corporate does not move that fast. And while Gen Y and Gen Z make up 66% of the workforce, only 6% of them identify leadership as their career choice. Number two, waves. As politics, policies, supply and demand, and the competitive need for humans to have more, quote unquote, as well as lifespan increases and the lack of support from government institutions, the LFPR, not employment stats, will fluctuate massively. Three, not just flexibility, but adaptability of the demographic makeup of the workforce of the next 20 years. Authenticity beats authority. Gen Y and Gen Z acknowledge title, but influence through their behavior of their respective leaders. And lastly, leadership will be defined not by technology, not by processes, but by understanding what motivates a 70, 60, 50, 40, 30, 25, and 18-year-old on the same team. Begin coaching and mentoring as soon as possible. And remember Fractionals Edge formula relevant to that last point. People, process, and technology in that order. Don't screw it up. If there are any questions, please leave them in the chat. Feel free to DM me at my LinkedIn account. I'll leave that last slide up for a few seconds. So feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn. I would value and welcome all of your input, all of your comments, all of your feedback. I thank you so much. Again, my name is Dale Bondanza. My company is DAB Enterprises, LLC, also doing business as Fractionals Edge, where I provide fractional CIO and fractional PMO services, as well as staffing needs for your respective organizations. If there's anything I can do to help your organization, feel free to reach out. Thank you so much and have a great day. Peace and calm to you all.